The house had always been too quiet at night. Since my husband's passing, the once comforting silence felt oppressive, the kind that pressed in on you, forcing you to confront the emptiness. I'd grown used to it over the years, though. A glass of wine, a book I wasn't really reading, and the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway were my companions now. But since Nathan moved into the guest house a few weeks ago, the quiet wasn't the same. At first, I thought having him here would help fill the void, that the faint sounds of his footsteps across the yard, or the occasional laugh from his phone calls, would bring a sense of life back into the place. It did, in a way. But it also brought something else, something I hadn't anticipated. Nathan wasn't a boy anymore. He'd grown into a man without me noticing, his broad shoulders and confident smile so far removed from the awkward teenager who used to shuffle into the kitchen looking for snacks. He was 28 now, his energy vibrant and his presence magnetic. And as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure how to reconcile the boy I used to know with the man standing in front of me. It was one of those evenings when the air felt thick, the sky threatening rain that never came. I had spent the better part of an hour tidying up, trying to shake the restlessness that had been clinging to me all day. By the time I finally made my way upstairs, I was exhausted but still too wound up to sleep. I changed into a loose-fitting tank top and pajama shorts, letting the cool fabric settle against my skin, and stood by the dresser brushing my hair. The mirror caught the faint glow of the living room lights I'd left on downstairs, and I frowned, realizing I'd forgotten to close the curtains. It didn't seem like a big deal at first. The house sat on a large piece of land, the yard sprawling between the main house and the guest house where Nathan stayed. There was no one around for miles. But as I made my way back down the stairs, I hesitated at the bottom, something tugging at the edge of my thoughts. When I reached the window, I froze. Through the open curtains across the yard, I could see the light on in Nathan's guest house. The blinds were drawn up just enough to reveal him sitting at the small desk by the window. His laptop screen cast a faint blue glow across his face, and he seemed absorbed in whatever he was doing. I should have turned away. Should have closed the curtains and gone back upstairs. But before I could, he looked up. Our eyes met, the distance between us doing nothing to lessen the impact of his gaze. For a moment, I couldn't move, caught in the intensity of his stare. His expression wasn't one of embarrassment or surprise. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't name but felt deep in my chest. The spell broke when I reached up to pull the curtains closed, my hands trembling slightly as I yanked the fabric together. My breath came fast and shallow as I stood there, the weight of the moment settling over me. What had I been thinking? Standing there like that? Watching him? Letting him watch me? I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady my racing heart. It didn't mean anything, I told myself. It was just an accident. But as I climbed the stairs and slipped back into bed, I couldn't shake the image of him, the way his eyes lingered, the way my pulse quickened under his gaze. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into a simple glance. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, painting the countertops in soft gold. I stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with a mechanical precision that came from years of habit. The scent of coffee filled the air, rich and familiar, but it did little to steady the unease lingering from the night before. I hadn't slept well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nathan's face in the dim glow of his guesthouse window, the way his gaze had locked on mine through the open curtains. It was a look that had stayed with me, unsettling in its intensity, though I couldn't quite bring myself to name why. The sound of the screen door creaking open pulled me from my thoughts. Nathan stepped into the kitchen, his hair still damp from a shower, wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans that clung to his lean athletic frame. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Morning," I replied, glancing over my shoulder. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Pancakes, huh? You must be in a good mood." I let out a soft laugh, though it felt forced. "It's just what was in the pantry." Nathan arched a brow, his smile widening. "You say that like I didn't see the stash of frozen waffles last week." Fine, I admitted, shaking my head. Maybe I felt like cooking? Lucky me, he teased, grabbing a mug from the cabinet and pouring himself a cup of coffee. I busied myself with the pancakes, flipping the last one onto a plate before turning to set everything on the table. Nathan was already there, his long legs stretched out under the small breakfast nook. Dig in, I said, sliding the plate toward him. He didn't hesitate, grabbing a pancake and drowning it in syrup. You know, he said between bites, I could get used to this. What? I asked, sitting across from him. This, he said, gesturing to the plate. A real breakfast. Someone to talk to in the morning. I frowned slightly, his words catching me off guard. You didn't have that before? Nathan shrugged, his expression turning thoughtful. Not really. Living alone, it's easy to fall into bad habits. Grabbing a granola bar on the way out the door, eating takeout at midnight. That doesn't sound very sustainable, I said softly. It wasn't, he admitted, his gaze meeting mine. That's part of why I came back. I hesitated, my fork poised over my plate. To reset? Something like that, he said, his tone quieter now. I needed a change. And honestly, I missed this place. I missed you. His words hit harder than I expected, and I felt my chest tighten. It's good to have you here, I said softly. Nathan's eyes lingered on mine for a moment before he looked away, a faint smile playing on his lips. So, he said, changing the subject, what's on the agenda today? Just the usual, I said, grateful for the shift. Some cleaning, a little gardening, nothing exciting. Gardening, huh? He said, leaning back in his chair. Mind if I help? I blinked, caught off guard again. You want to help? With gardening? Why not? He said with a shrug. I could use the fresh air. Fair warning, I said, smiling despite myself. It's not as glamorous as it sounds, mostly pulling weeds and hauling mulch. I'll take my chances, he said, his grin teasing. By the time we finished breakfast, the tension from the night before had eased, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of our conversation. But as Nathan carried the dishes to the sink and rolled up his sleeves to help me wash them, I couldn't ignore the subtle undercurrent between us. The way his arm brushed against mine as we stood side by side. The warmth of his presence lingering even after he stepped away. As I watched him laugh at a joke I barely remembered telling, I felt something stir deep within me. A mix of unease and exhilaration that I couldn't quite name. And for the first time, I wondered if I was ready to face what it meant. The garden was a mess. Overgrown and wild from years of neglect. It had been my husband's pride and joy, a place he spent hours tending to with careful precision. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to step foot in it for months. And when I finally did, the tangled vines and weeds felt like a reflection of my own grief, a beautiful thing left to ruin. Now as I stood with Nathan in the middle of it, a pair of gardening gloves in one hand and a trowel in the other, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. This is a lot, Nathan said, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the chaos. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. I told you it wasn't glamorous. Glamorous isn't the word I'd use, he said, grinning. But I like a challenge. I handed him a pair of gloves and nodded toward the far corner of the garden. If you're serious about helping, start over there. Those weeds have been mocking me for months. Yes, ma'am, he said with a mock salute, pulling on the gloves and grabbing a spade. I watched him for a moment as he knelt down and got to work, his broad shoulders flexing with the effort of pulling up stubborn roots. The sun caught in his hair, highlighting streaks of gold I hadn't noticed before, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Shaking myself, I turned back to my own section of the garden, determined to focus on the task at hand. We worked in companionable silence for a while. The only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional grunt from Nathan as he wrestled with particularly persistent weeds. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the warmth of the day settled over us like a heavy blanket. Hey, Nathan called after a while, his voice breaking the quiet. What's this thing? I looked up to see him holding a small, rusted garden ornament, a metal bird that had once perched on a stake, but now looked worse for wear. It's a cardinal, I said, walking over to him. It was your dad's favorite. He said it reminded him of his mother. Nathan turned the ornament over in his hands, his expression thoughtful. Funny, he said softly. I don't remember this. He got it a few years before he passed, I said, my voice quieter now. He used to joke that it was watching over the garden for him. Nathan smiled faintly, his thumb brushing against the faded paint. Guess we should put it back where it belongs, huh? I nodded, my chest tight as I watched him carry it to a nearby flower bed and stake it into the ground. By midday, we were both covered in dirt and sweat, our arms aching from hours of pulling weeds and hauling mulch. But the garden was starting to take shape, the chaos slowly giving way to order. We sat on the edge of the patio to take a break, a pitcher of lemonade between us. Nathan leaned back on his elbows, his face tilted toward the sun, and I couldn't help but steal a glance at him. "You've got dirt on your face," I said, smiling despite myself. He grinned, wiping at his cheek. "Better?" "Not even close," I said, laughing. Nathan leaned forward, grabbing the edge of his shirt to wipe his face. The movement exposed a sliver of his stomach, the lean lines of muscle catching the light, and I felt my breath hitch before I quickly looked away. "Better now?" he asked, his voice teasing. "Much," I said, forcing myself to focus on the lemonade in my hands. Nathan watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said softly, "this is the most I've seen you smile in weeks." I glanced at him, startled by the shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" "I just mean." He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "It's nice to see you happy. You've been through a lot, and I know it hasn't been easy." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet warmth in his gaze, it was enough to make my chest ache. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. Nathan smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I just want you to know I'm here." We finished the day by replanting a few flower beds, the once wild garden now looking like a place full of possibility. As we stood back to admire our work, Nathan let out a low whistle. "Not bad," he said, grinning. "Not bad at all," I agreed, my heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He turned to me, his smile softening. "Thanks for letting me help. I know this place means a lot to you." "It does," I said quietly, "but I think it's starting to mean a lot to you too." Nathan didn't reply right away, his gaze lingering on mine. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice low. The air between us felt still, charged, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But then he stepped back, his hand brushing lightly against mine as he turned toward the guest house. "See you at dinner?" he asked, his voice casual, as though nothing had changed. "Yeah," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "See you then." But as I watched him walk away, his figure framed by the fading light, I knew something had shifted. And I wasn't sure I could ignore it anymore. The night had settled over the house, bringing with it a deep, almost tangible stillness. The garden lights cast a soft glow across the yard, the faint hum of crickets filling the silence. I sat on the porch swing, a blanket draped over my lap, a glass of wine cradled in my hands. The day had left me physically exhausted, but my mind was far from still. I kept thinking about Nathan, his easy laugh, the way his hand had brushed mine when we'd finished planting, and the lingering warmth of his presence that seemed to follow me even now. The creak of the porch steps broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see Nathan standing there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not really. Thought I'd see if you were still up." "I'm always up," I said with a soft laugh, gesturing to the empty seat beside me. He hesitated for only a moment before crossing the porch and settling onto the swing, his long legs stretched out in front of him. For a while, neither of us spoke. The swing swayed gently, the quiet between us comfortable but charged. "Today was nice," Nathan said eventually, his voice breaking the silence. "It was," I agreed, taking a sip of my wine. "The garden hasn't looked that good in years." "It's more than that," he said, his tone thoughtful. "It felt good. Working side by side with you, talking. I don't know. It's been a while since I felt like that." "Like what?" I asked, glancing at him. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared out into the yard. "Like I belonged somewhere," he said softly. His words struck something deep within me, and I felt my chest tighten. "You've always belonged here," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Maybe," he said, his gaze flicking to mine. "But it feels different now." The weight of his words hung in the air, and I wasn't sure how to respond. I shifted slightly on the swing, my hands tightening around the glass. I didn't realize you felt that way, I said after a moment. Nathan turned to me, his expression unreadable. You make it easy, he said quietly. Make what easy? Being here, he said, his voice soft. Talking to you, spending time with you, it feels right. My breath hitched and I looked away, my chest tightening. Nathan, I don't know if... You don't have to say anything, he said gently, cutting me off. I just wanted you to know. The quiet conviction in his voice, the sincerity in his gaze, it was too much. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and I quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by my reaction. I'm sorry, I said softly, my voice breaking. Don't be, Nathan said, his hand moving to cover mine. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. You don't have to apologize for how you feel. I don't know what I feel, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's fingers tightened slightly around mine. That's okay, he said. We don't have to figure it all out right now. His words, his touch, they calmed me in a way I hadn't expected. I looked at him then, my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time I let myself really see him, not as my late husband's son, but as the man sitting beside me, offering me comfort and understanding. Nathan? I began, but I didn't know what I was going to say. You can tell me, he said softly, his gaze steady. I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling in my lap. I'm scared, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I know, he said quietly. I don't want to hurt you, I said, my voice breaking, or ruin this, whatever this is. You're not going to hurt me, Nathan said firmly. And this doesn't have to be anything more than what it is right now. His calm reassurance, the quiet strength in his voice, it was enough to make my chest ache. I don't know how to do this, I said softly, my eyes filling with tears. You don't have to know, Nathan said, his hand lifting to brush a tear from my cheek. We'll figure it out together. The tenderness in his touch, the quiet certainty in his voice, it unraveled me completely. I leaned into him, my head resting against his shoulder, as the swing swayed gently beneath us. Nathan's arms slid around me, holding me close, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of my loneliness begin to lift. We sat there in silence, the night wrapping around us like a cocoon. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face everything alone. The next day unfolded slowly, the way lazy summer mornings often did. I lingered over my coffee longer than usual, staring out the kitchen window at the garden we had worked so hard on the day before. The flowers we replanted stood tall and proud, their colors vibrant in the morning light, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Last night had left a mark I couldn't ignore. The way Nathan had looked at me, the way his voice wrapped around those simple, grounding words. I could still feel the weight of his arm around me, the quiet reassurance of his presence. But the reality of it, the truth of what was brewing between us, made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure how to move forward without making everything come undone. I was still lost in thought when Nathan walked into the kitchen. His steps light but purposeful. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt and athletic shorts, his hair slightly mussed, as though he had just come in from a run. Morning, he said, his voice warm, as though nothing about last night had unsettled him. Morning, I replied, forcing a small smile. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the faint clink of the spoon against the mug filling the quiet. He leaned against the counter, his gaze flicking to me as he sipped. You okay? He asked, his tone casual but probing. Fine, I said too quickly. Just thinking. About? I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my coffee mug. The garden, I lied. It's coming along nicely. Nathan smiled, his eyes softening. It is. You should be proud. You did most of the work, I said, trying to deflect. He shrugged, setting his mug down. I didn't mind. It gave me an excuse to spend time with you. His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. My breath caught, but before I could respond, Nathan changed the subject. What's the plan for today? He asked, stepping closer to the table where I sat. I hadn't thought that far ahead, I admitted, grateful for the shift. Well, he said, leaning forward slightly, his hands braced on the back of a chair. Why don't we tackle the attic? I noticed a few boxes up there yesterday. Thought maybe you could use a hand sorting through them. I hesitated, my chest tightening at the thought of being in such close quarters with him. But the way he looked at me, so eager and earnest, made it impossible to say no. Okay, I said softly. Let's do it. The attic was sweltering, the midday heat seeping through the roof and settling over us like a heavy blanket. Dust motes danced in the beams of light streaming through the small, grimy window, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. "This is a treasure trove," Nathan said, his voice laced with amusement as he opened a box labeled miscellaneous. "More like a time capsule," I said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. We worked side by side, sorting through the remnants of a life lived and loved, old photo albums, faded holiday decorations, the occasional knick-knack that sparked a memory. Nathan pulled out a stack of old vinyl records, his brow furrowing as he examined them. "These are classics," he said, holding up a Fleetwood Mac album. "My husband's," I said softly, the words catching in my throat. Nathan looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you want to keep them?" I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't been able to let go of much. Feels like losing him all over again." Nathan set the records aside, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's not about letting go," he said gently. "It's about making room for something new." His words struck a chord and I felt my chest tighten. We worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of unpacking and sorting settling into something almost meditative. But the quiet didn't last. Nathan reached for a box on the top shelf, his fingers brushing against it just as the lid slipped off. A cascade of papers and mementos rained down around us, and I let out a startled laugh as I scrambled to help him pick them up. "Sorry," he said, grinning sheepishly as he crouched beside me. "It's fine," I said, shaking my head. Our hands moved in tandem, sorting through the scattered contents until one of his fingers brushed against mine. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. I froze, my breath catching as I looked up at him. Nathan was already watching me, his expression soft but intense, his hand lingering against mine just a moment too long. The attic felt impossibly small, the air between us charged and heavy. "Nathan," I began, my voice trembling. "You feel it too," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something that would break the moment, but the words wouldn't come. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." He started to pull his hand away, but I stopped him, my fingers curling around his instinctively. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world outside the attic seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of our breaths and the weight of what neither of us dared to say. The attic was silent, except for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath us. My hand lingered on his, my fingers trembling, but resolute. For a moment I forgot about everything else. The labels, the boundaries, the years that separated us. All I could focus on was the way his touch sent warmth coursing through me. The way his gaze held mine as though he could see every guarded piece of me I'd worked so hard to hide. "I don't know what this is," I whispered, my voice breaking the stillness. Nathan's thumb brushed lightly against the back of my hand, his touch tentative but steady. "It doesn't have to be anything," he said softly. "Not right now." But it already was. I knew it, and I could see in his eyes that he did too. The weight of everything, his closeness, his words, the unspoken tension that had been building between us for weeks, pressed down on me, leaving me breathless. "I can't," I began, but my words faltered. Nathan shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. But I wanted to. I wanted to say something, anything that would make sense of the storm inside me. "This is wrong," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Then why does it feel so right?" he asked gently, his eyes searching mine. I had no answer. The truth was, I didn't know. Before I could stop myself, I rose to my feet, my hands slipping from his as I moved to the small attic window. The view outside was simple. Trees swaying in the breeze, the garden we had tended to just the day before, the guest house where he lived. But it felt like the walls were closing in. Like the space between us wasn't physical, but something far more overwhelming. Nathan followed, his footsteps slow and deliberate. When he stopped behind me, I could feel the heat of him, the steady presence that had always made me feel safe and unsettled in equal measure. "Talk to me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," he said simply. The truth? It was such a simple request, but the words stuck in my throat. I don't know how to, I admitted, my voice trembling. Nathan stepped closer, his hands lifting to gently cup my arms. Then let me start, he said, his gaze steady. I care about you. I've always cared about you. And I don't know when it changed, but it did. And I can't pretend it didn't. His words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over me with a force I wasn't prepared for. Nathan? I know it's complicated, he continued, his voice unwavering. I know it scares you. It scares me too. But I can't ignore this. I won't. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, my chest tightening. You deserve more than this. More than me. That's not for you to decide, he said firmly, his hands tightening ever so slightly on my arms. You're the only one who makes me feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. His words broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I reached up, my hands resting lightly on his chest. The warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart beneath my palms, it was too much and not enough all at once. Nathan, this isn't fair to you, I said softly, my voice trembling. What's not fair, he said, his voice low, is asking me to pretend I don't feel this way when I do. His honesty, his unflinching gaze, it was the final push I didn't know I needed. I didn't realize I was moving until I felt the soft press of his lips against mine. The kiss was tentative, almost hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands curling into the fabric of his shirt as the kiss deepened. The warmth of his touch, the steady strength of his arms wrapping around me, it unraveled me completely. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a release, a breaking of all the walls I had spent years building around myself. Every fear, every doubt, every rule I had clung to melted away, leaving only the raw, unguarded truth of what I felt for him. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested together, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. This is crazy, I whispered, my voice trembling. Maybe, Nathan said, his lips brushing lightly against mine. But it's real. His words settled over me like a balm, soothing the storm inside me, even as it threatened to stir again. I don't know what happens next, I admitted, my voice barely audible. Neither do I, he said softly, but we'll figure it out. Together. The quiet conviction in his voice, the steady warmth of his gaze, it was enough to make me believe him. For the first time, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, we could. The morning light seeped through the cracks in the attic window, painting the room in soft, muted hues. I sat on the edge of the bed in my room, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The air felt heavy, still charged with the emotions of the night before. I had barely slept. My mind kept replaying the kiss, the way Nathan's arms had felt around me, the way his voice had steadied me when I was teetering on the edge of doubt. It was impossible to untangle the emotions swirling inside me. Fear, exhilaration, guilt, hope. A soft knock at the door broke through my thoughts. My heart leaped, and for a moment, I debated pretending I wasn't there. But the knock came again, gentle but insistent, and I found myself rising to answer it. Nathan stood in the hallway, his hair slightly tousled, his eyes warm and searching. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee, the faintest smile playing on his lips. I figured you might need this, he said softly, holding one out to me. Thank you, I murmured, my fingers brushing against his as I took the mug. He lingered in the doorway for a moment before nodding toward the bed. Mind if I sit? I hesitated but eventually stepped aside, closing the door softly behind him. Nathan moved to the edge of the bed, his posture relaxed, but his eyes watchful, as though he was gauging every shift in my expression. I sat down beside him, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. How are you feeling? He asked, his voice quiet. I let out a shaky breath, staring into the dark liquid in my mug. I don't know, I admitted. Everything feels different. It is different, he said, his tone steady, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. I looked at him then, my chest tightening at the quiet conviction in his gaze. Nathan, this isn't just about us. It's about everything. About how people would see this, how they'd judge us, how they'd judge me. People will always judge, he said simply, his hand resting lightly on the bed between us. But they don't know you like I do. They don't see what I see. And what do you see? I asked, my voice trembling. Nathan's eyes softened and he shifted closer, his hand brushing lightly against mine. I see someone who's been caring too much for too long. Someone who deserves to feel loved, to feel alive. His words unraveled me, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. Nathan, I don't know if I can do this, I said, my voice breaking. You don't have to have all the answers right now, he said gently, his hand curling around mine. We don't have to figure everything out today or tomorrow. We'll take it one step at a time. The quiet strength in his voice, the warmth of his touch, it was enough to make the fear recede, if only for a moment. We spent the rest of the morning together, talking in soft, unhurried tones. Nathan listened as I spoke about my fears, my doubts, the weight of the past that still clung to me, and in return, he shared pieces of himself that he had kept hidden. His own struggles with feeling adrift, his longing for connection, his quiet determination to find something real. By the time the sun reached its peak in the sky, the heaviness in my chest had begun to lift. Later that afternoon, we stood together on the porch, the garden stretching out before us in vibrant greens and golds. Nathan leaned against the railing, his arms crossed as he watched the breeze ripple through the trees. It's beautiful, isn't it? He said, his voice tinged with quiet wonder. It is, I agreed, my gaze drifting over the flowers we had planted, the soft hum of life returning to a place that had once felt so empty. Nathan turned to me, his expression thoughtful. This feels like a beginning, he said softly. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. A beginning of what? He smiled, small but sure. Of whatever we want it to be. His words hung in the air, and for the first time I let myself believe them. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the path ahead. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and perhaps even regret. But for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't facing it alone. Nathan had shown me that it was okay to let go, to make room for something new, something unexpected. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a quiet sense of hope settle over me. We didn't have all the answers, but maybe we didn't need them. For now, the promise of something more was enough.